The briefing said, educational exchange, low risk, civilian environment. They forgot to mention the human. Or maybe they mentioned her, and nobody read past the word juvenile. I filed 17 incident reports in my career. Hostile contact, equipment failure. 2 that involve things I still can't explain to my supervisor without her giving me the look. The one that means file it under stress related and move on. 17 reports in 9 years, and not one of them prepared me for a 40-kilogram Terran female in the third row who looked at the apex evaluation creature we'd spent 6 months acquiring, smiled at it, smiled, and completely, utterly broke everything we thought we understood about the species. The creature flinched. She didn't. I need you to understand what that means. I need you to understand what we thought we were bringing into that room and what was already sitting there waiting for it, chewing something called a granola bar and looking bored. This is not a story about a monster. This is a story about the thing that wasn't scared of one. My name is Osivek for Tarhin, and I have been the Cultural Integration Liaison for the Galactic Cooperative's Secondary Academic Exchange Program for 3 years, 2 months, and, as of this morning, what feels like several additional decades I didn't consent to. I also have a problem with my lower left auxiliary joint, which means I tap it against any available surface when I'm nervous. My supervisor calls it the clicking. She has asked me, on 4 separate occasions, to stop. I have agreed on 4 separate occasions, and then forgotten within minutes, because some things are bigger than professional courtesy. I was clicking before the creature even arrived. The classroom was on Vetus Station, neutral ground, which was the point. The program ran on the philosophy that young minds across species could benefit from shared academic exposure. That xenophobia was a failure of familiarity, that the antidote to fear was simply knowing. Noble. I believed it mostly. I'd seen it work. I'd watched a Kala juvenile and a Durini child figure out they both hated the same kind of mathematics problem, and in that shared suffering, something genuine happened. So yes, I believed in the program. I did not believe in today's program, which had been designed 3 levels above my clearance and handed to me with a memo that read, Species Integration Exercise, Advanced Cohort, Special Guest Classification Tier 4. Tier 4 meant restricted. Tier 4 meant I had signed 11 documents before being told what was in the transport crate they were bringing into my classroom. A Vethkarn. If you don't know what a Vethkarn is, picture the evolutionary winner of a planet that spent 400 million years trying to kill itself. Not large. Not particularly fast by absolute standards, but built with a redundancy of instinct that made most evaluated species register it as a threat before they could consciously identify what they were looking at. Pheromone signaling that bypassed rational cognition. It didn't need to chase you. You fled before you knew you were running. We had acquired one, juvenile, habituated to controlled environments, theoretically calm, for a behavioral study. Someone in academic exchange had decided this was also, somehow, an educational opportunity. A demonstration. What does threat response look like across species? What is the universal language of danger? 23 students. Mixed species. All 17 and 18 standard years. All theoretically prepared, having signed the same stack of documents I had, having been briefed by people calmer than me. And one human. She'd been placed in the exchange as a late addition. A Terran girl. I'd read her file on the transport over. Mira, 18 standard, had done 2 years in something called a wildfire suppression corps before the academic program. File noted, adaptable, maintains composure under environmental stress, recommend placement in advanced cohort. There was a medical note I'd flagged and then set aside because it hadn't seemed relevant until this exact moment, standing outside my own classroom with my joint clicking like broken machinery. The note said, patient reports prior trauma response desensitization. Standard threat pheromone sensitivity, 12% of species baseline. I had not understood what that meant. I understand now. I went in first. Protocol. I set up at the front, checked the environmental seals, confirmed the restraint parameters on the creature's enclosure. A transparent partition at the room's east wall, climate controlled, the Vethkarn inside looking like something between a sculpture and a bad idea. The students filed in over the next 10 minutes. I watched their faces. The Khalid pair sat furthest from the partition and immediately began breathing in their deep regulation pattern, the one their species used to manage cortisol. The Durini male came in, registered the enclosure, and sat in the second-to-last row with his secondary eyes fully dilated. A Synth exchange student, calm species, famously equanimous, walked through the door, took one look, turned around, and walked back out. I let her go. That was also protocol. Mira came in sixth. She had her bag over one shoulder and something in her mouth, the granola bar, I would later determine, and she looked at the Veth car in the way you look at a traffic delay. Mild, slightly inconvenienced. She picked a seat in the third row, which was not the back, which was not even the middle, and she sat down and pulled out a writing implement and a paper notebook. Paper, notebook, like an artifact from whatever century preceded portable data storage. I watched her look at the Veth Karn again. It was watching her back. They do that. The Veth Karn, they track motion, they track stillness. They're always calculating something I cannot name. The room's other students were cycling through the physiological signatures of threat response. Elevated respiration, postural compression, the specific kind of stillness that living things adopt when they're hoping not to be noticed. Mira wrote something in her notebook. I couldn't read it from the front of the room. I found out afterward it was a grocery list she'd been composing since breakfast. She'd remembered she needed something called tahini. I started the briefing. Standard preamble. Species overview. The Veth Karn's evolutionary context. Threat pheromone mechanics. Why the controlled environment was necessary. My voice was steady. I have trained for steady. The clicking of my joint was not steady. Mira looked up from her notebook at the sound. Found the source. Looked at me with an expression I can only describe as concerned in the specific way of someone who's decided not to say anything yet. The Veth Karn shifted in its enclosure. The room contracted, not literally, but the way air contracts when 17 organisms all hold their breath at the same moment. A soft, collective tightening. The Khalid pair's regulation breathing stopped. The Durini male pressed himself further back in his seat. The Veth Karn pressed one of its sensory appendages against the partition. And Mira leaned forward. Not back. Not sideways. Forward. Elbows on the desk. Chin tilted. The way you lean in when something finally gets interesting. The Veth Karn went very still. I've been told they did that sometimes, went still, but I've been told it was a predatory response. The calculation before action pause. I've been told it was the moment before. I started, in the clinical language of my own panicking brain, composing the incident report. At approximately 9:40 station time, the subject, the Veth Karn, made a sound. Low. Uncertain. A frequency I hadn't heard in any of the briefing recordings. Is that, said Mira, to no one in particular, a distress call? The room looked at her. She looked at me. I looked at my notes, which said nothing about distress calls, and then I looked at the Veth Karn, which had pressed itself to the far wall of the enclosure, its sensory array folded inward, a posture that the briefing materials described as self-protective in juveniles under extreme. Oh, Ms. Mira, I said, and I was very proud of how level my voice was. What you're describing would imply that the subject is scared, she said. Yeah. She said it the way you say the coffee's cold or it's going to rain. Just a fact. A mild, slightly regrettable fact she'd already incorporated and moved on from. What? Said the Durini male from the back row. Is it scared of? Mira looked at him, looked back at the Veth Karn, tapped her pen against her notebook, once, twice, in a rhythm that sounded uncomfortably like my own clicking. Probably all of us, she said. But I think mostly me. She was right. The pheromone analysis came back 6 hours later, while I was on my third cup of something the station cafeteria called Calming Blend, and I called barely adequate. The Veth Karn's threat response chemistry had spiked. Not at the room, not at the Khalid pair or the Durini male, or any of the students whose physiologies were singing distress signals. At Mira, specifically at Mira, who had registered to its sensory system as something it did not have a category for. Something that was supposed to run and hadn't. Something that had leaned in. I filed the first incident report of this story at 15:22 station time. It would not be the last. The second session was not my idea. I want that on record. Incident report 2 of, however, many this ends up being. The decision to continue the integration exercise came from academic oversight, not from me, and I register my concerns in writing at 8 o'clock the following morning in a memo that used the phrase operationally inadvisable 4 times, which is the professional equivalent of screaming. They approved continuation by 8:45. I was clicking so hard by the time I reached the classroom that a passing Zenith maintenance worker asked if I needed medical attention. Mira was already there when I arrived. She'd come 20 minutes early, which I found out later was a habit she developed in the Wildfire Corps. She called it getting the ground under your feet before anyone else complicates it. She was sitting in the same third-row seat, same paper notebook, same pen. She'd also brought 2 cups of something in a thermos that she'd acquired from somewhere in the station's lower commercial ring. She held one out when I walked through the door. I stared at it. "It's tea," she said. "Station vendor on level 4 has something close to Terran Black. I asked if your species could process tannins. I checked, they can so." I took the cup. I don't know why I took the cup. Some things happen before you decide on them. It was, as it turned out, the best thing I drank the entire week. I didn't tell her that. I filed it as a minor positive under cross-species goodwill gesture, low risk, and I try not to think about how she'd researched my species biochemistry before bringing me something warm on a difficult morning. The other students arrived over the next 15 minutes. The Khalid pair came back, which surprised me. The Darini male did not. 2 new observers from the research division sat in the back with data recording equipment, which was fine, expected, not at all evidence that academic oversight had decided this had become interesting enough to document more formally. The Vethkarn's enclosure had been modified overnight. Larger. The partition now had an acoustic layer. The creature's distress vocalizations from the day before had apparently flagged something in the welfare protocols, and someone had actually responded to it. The partition also had, I noticed with a specific feeling of realizing something is further along than you thought, a secondary access panel. Small. Manual release, not automated. I asked the research observer nearest me what that was for. She said, "Mira requested it." I said, "I'm sorry." She said, "She submitted a request to behavioral research at 2200 hours last night. They approved it at 6:30. She said it like that was normal. Like a civilian exchange, students submitting requests directly to research divisions at 2200 hours and getting them approved before sunrise was just a thing that happened. I looked at Mira, who was writing something in her notebook and not looking back at me, and I thought about the tea, and I thought, what exactly did your file not tell me? The session began as I'd structured it. Context, overview, the academic framework that justified all of this. The Vethkarn was quieter than the day before. Present. Watchful. It had eaten, according to the welfare report, which meant its threat response chemistry should have been lower. Calmer. It was watching Mira. Not the way it had watched her yesterday. That frozen predator calculation stillness. Something else. Something I didn't have a behavioral category for and found deeply inconvenient. I was 20 minutes into the session when Mira raised her hand. "Yes," I said. "Can I try something?" The research observer's equipment was already running. One of them had leaned forward. I looked at the Vethkarn. I looked at Mira. I looked at the access panel. "What kind of something?" I said. "Nothing dramatic," she said, which was the least reassuring possible answer. She stood up. She moved to the partition slowly, not cautiously, not the way prey moves when it's trying not to trigger something, but the way someone moves when they don't want to startle a bird. Deliberate. Even. She crouched down when she got close, which brought her eye level to below the creature's primary visual range, making herself smaller. Not submissive. Not cowering. Something else. Something that looked, in the most baffling possible way, like courtesy. The Vethkarn didn't move. She reached in her bag, pulled something out, set it against the base of the partition, a piece of what I would later identify as dried fruit, something she'd apparently brought specifically for this from a vendor on level 6 that sold preserved Terran goods. She set it down. Step back. 1 step, 2, 3. Returned to her crouch position. and then she waited. The room was so quiet I could hear my own joint. I had forgotten to click. I didn't realize until later. The Vethkarn moved. Low to the ground, side-facing. The behavioral literature called this a non-confrontational approach vector, which I'd read about, but never seen because you don't see it often because it requires the other organism to not be running. It moved to the partition. It extended one sensory appendage through the acoustic layer's lower gap. It touched the fruit, retracted, stilled, extended again. Mira didn't move. The Vethkarn made the sound from yesterday, low, uncertain, but shorter. A question, maybe, I don't know. I am not qualified to categorize it. I just know it was different. Mira made a sound back. Not the same sound. Something that came from her chest, low and continuous, a vibration without consonants. One of the research observers later identified it as similar to Terran vocalizations used with distressed juvenile mammals. Mira later called it, when I asked, just kind of humming. The Vethkarn ate the fruit. I filed 3 forms after that session. One was routine documentation. One was a welfare update for the creature. The third was a formal request to Research Division for Myra's complete file. Not the exchange program summary, the complete file, whatever clearance level it took. It took clearance 6. I have clearance 5. I called in a favor I'd been saving for 3 years to get to clearance 6 for 48 hours. The complete file had 17 pages the exchange summary didn't. Most of it was the wildfire core record, controlled burns, emergency terrain assessment, extended solo deployments in environments assessed as high biological hazard, meaning things live there that didn't want her in their territory, and she'd learned to move through them anyway. The medical notes were longer, too. The trauma desensitization wasn't just phenomenal. It was, I'm summarizing a document written in Terran medical terminology I had to run through 2 translation passes. It was the result of enough exposure to enough things that were dangerous that her nervous system had essentially reclassified what danger meant. Not absence of fear. The file was clear on that. She still registered threat signals. She just didn't let them run the show. One of the wildfire core evaluations, written by a Terran supervisor, used a phrase I wrote down and had not stopped thinking about. She's the kind of person who finds out what scared her and then goes back to understand it. Page 9. I wrote on a piece of paper and put it in my secondary work bag, which is where I keep things that won't leave me alone. The third day, the Vethkarn waited at the partition when Mira walked in. Not pressing against it, not vocalizing. Just there, on its side of the barrier, positioned in the place where she usually crouched, present the way something is present when it has decided another thing is familiar. Mira stopped when she saw it. For the first time in 3 days, I saw something on her face that wasn't equanimity. Just a fraction. Just a moment, something that moved through her expression and left before I could name it. She sat down in her seat instead of going to the partition. She opened her notebook. She wrote something that I, standing at the front of the room, could this time read. It said, "Don't let it get attached." 3 words and a period. Then she turned the page and started on something else. I pretended I hadn't seen it. I clicked my joint steadily for the rest of the session, and I thought about a lot of things I don't usually let myself think about during working hours. On the 4th day, Oversight sent a delegate. Her name was Senior Coordinator Valoriz, and she had the kind of stillness that powerful people develop when they've spent long enough in rooms where things happen and are never surprised by any of it. She sat in the back. She had no recording equipment. She watched everything with an expression that gave me nothing to read, which I found profoundly worse than hostility. I'd stopped sleeping well. I want to note that. Not for sympathy, I don't expect sympathy for operational discomfort, but because it's relevant to the state I was in when the 4th day broke open. I had also stopped drinking the cafeteria's calming blend. It wasn't working anymore. Mira brought tea again. The Vethkarn had declined food from the research staff overnight. Not dramatically. It wasn't distressed. Welfare confirmed that. It had simply shown no interest. It sat in its enclosure, and it was quiet, and it waited. When Mira walked into the room, it made a sound immediately. Not the uncertain low frequency from day one. Something else. Shorter. Directed. The research observer in the back row, the one who'd been cross-referencing the acoustic data for 3 days, stopped typing and went very still. Mira acknowledged the sound with a small nod, the way you acknowledge someone calling your name across a room when you're busy with something else. I heard you, hang on. She sat down, got out her notebook. Then she looked up directly at the enclosure and the Vethkarn came to the partition. It had something, a fragment of something from its enclosure. Enrichment material the welfare team had provided, a piece of textured composite used for sensory stimulation. Small, irregular, held against the base of the partition's acoustic gap. It was offering it. The room was doing the hell breath thing again. I was not breathing either. Coordinator Valorise, in the back, had set down whatever she'd been holding. Mira looked at the object, looked at the creature, did the thing with her chest, the low, soundless hum. She reached forward and touched the fragment. Just her fingertips. Didn't take it. The Vethkarn held very still for 3 seconds. Then it released the fragment through the gap. A gift, or the nearest equivalent, left on her side of the barrier. Mira picked it up, turned it over in her fingers, set it on the corner of her desk where she could see it. She wrote something in her notebook. Not the grocery list. Not the 3-word caution from yesterday. I couldn't read it from where I stood. I had planned a structured session. 30 minutes of behavioral observation, 15 of guided academic reflection, students documenting their own responses, comparative analysis. I had a framework. I had materials. Valorise stood up. Mr. Tarhan, she said, I'd like to pause the scheduled session. I paused the scheduled session. She walked to the front of the room in that particular way she had, the way that made space around her without requiring it. She looked at the class. She looked at the enclosure. She looked at Mira, who looked back at her with the same mild, slightly considering expression she'd given me on day one. I want to ask you something, Valorise said to Mira. On the record. Mira waited. You requested the access panel modification before the second session. You brought behavioral modification materials from off-station. You appear to have developed a working nonverbal exchange with a species that has no documented successful non-confrontational contact with any organism outside its own. She paused. Did you know any of that would work? Mira considered the question with genuine seriousness. No, she said, but I knew what didn't work. Explain. It was scared. Scared things don't respond to demonstration of superiority. They don't respond to being watched from a distance. They respond to, she paused. Not for effect. She was actually finding the word. Consistency. Predictability. Not being a threat. Making yourself legible. You made yourself legible to it. I tried to. Same time, same seat, same movements. Let it figure out my pattern. It's not. She stopped again. Looked at the Vethkarn, which was still at the partition. It's not that different from a lot of things. Valorise was quiet for a moment. What is it? Mira turned the composite fragment over in her hand. Being something new in a room full of things that don't know what to do with you. The room held that for a long time. Too long for me to report it as anything other than what it was, a silence that had weight. The callid pair exchanged a look I couldn't read. The research observers were writing something. I could hear it but not see it. My joint was still. I hadn't noticed. Valorise returned to her seat without another word. I resumed the session. Somewhat. Mostly I asked the students to document what they'd observed over the 4 days, which felt less like academic exercise and more like something I needed on record to prove this had happened. Mira wrote for 11 minutes without stopping, filled 3 pages, turned back to page 2, and added something at the bottom in smaller writing. I dismissed the class at the scheduled time. Students filed out. Valorise lingered. I was collecting my materials from the front desk and doing the kind of not thinking that you do when you're thinking about too many things at once. The Vethkarn was in the back of its enclosure. It had not resumed the anxious motion pattern from the first day. It was just present, in the way that living things are present when they've stopped spending energy on threat assessment. Mira was the last student. She stopped at the door and looked back at the enclosure. The Vethkarn looked back. She made the hum, just for a moment. Then she left. I filed the final incident report that evening. Report 7. substantially different from the 6 before it. I had started those reports as a professional precaution. I finished this one because I needed to write what had happened somewhere that wasn't just my own head. The last section asked for lessons applicable to future integration exercises. I sat with that feel for a while. What I wanted to write, we brought the wrong thing into the room and called it the subject. What I wrote instead, because I am a professional and this is a professional document, recommend review of threat response assumptions in controlled species integration. Human subjects with relevant field experience may require revised classification protocols in high-stress behavioral research contexts. Further study advised. Velo Rees would read it. She would understand the 11 words hiding inside the 83. 2 days later, I received a message from Mira. A data text, brief, sent to my professional contact node, which she'd apparently gotten from the station directory. It said, "How's the joint?" Then, "I have a friend in medical engineering if you ever want to get it looked at." I sat there and I clicked my joint against my desk 4 times and I thought about a girl who researches alien biochemistry before bringing someone tea, who spent her evenings submitting welfare requests for creatures everyone else is afraid of, who writes "don't let it get attached" in her notebook, and 3 days later can't quite school her face when it brings her something small and textured as a gift. I thought about page 9. She's the kind of person who finds out what scared her and then goes back to understand it. I didn't write back that night. I needed a few more days. What I was still working out was this. We designed a study about fear, about how different species respond to threat. We'd built the protocols and filed the clearances and acquired the subject and controlled the environment. And we had been very thorough about all of it. We hadn't studied fear. We'd accidentally studied what happens when fear meets something patient enough to outlast it. Those are not the same experiment. I wrote back eventually. I told her the joint was fine. I didn't mention that I'd booked an appointment with the medical engineering department the morning after receiving her message. Some things you keep for yourself. The Vethkarn was returned to the Behavioral Research Center at the end of the exchange program. According to the welfare report filed 6 weeks later, it had begun accepting contact from 2 members of the research staff. Myra's academic file was updated with a commendation from Senior Coordinator Velo Rees. The commendation cited exceptional cross-species behavioral intuition and documented application of non-confrontational first contact principles. I don't know if Mira read it. I know she'd have written something dry and slightly self-deprecating in the margin if she had. I know this because she's the kind of person who does that. And I know more about what kind of person she is than her file ever told me, which is, I think, exactly the point.